Lainey and Glenn are from Opacum Land Trust. They're joining us this evening to discuss conservation restrictions. So
Yeah.
we'll hand the floor over to them.
Great, thank you for inviting us to come and talk tonight about conservation restrictions. And I'll just do a quick intro of who we are as Opacum Land Trust. We're a regional land conservation organization that works in the 13-town area, including Southbridge. And we actually own a couple properties in Southbridge, Clarebert's Wildlife Sanctuary and the Thompson Family Forever Wild Preserve. Both are open to the public with trails for people to come enjoy the different aspects of nature or go for a walk or a hike or however they want to hang out in these areas. So tonight we were going to talk about conservation restrictions, and I'm just wondering how much do you guys know about conservation restrictions and land conservation in general? I don't want to repeat anything that you guys may already know, but at the same time, I can start at the basics as well.
I would say start at the basics, give us a kind of a quick primer, and then
Yeah.
get into some details, I think.
Yeah.
Great.
And since it's being filmed,
Okay.
so I know a little bit about them, but I don't want you to start at that level.
Yeah, no, we're happy to start at the basics of what a conservation restriction is. So the way that Opacum and other conservation groups and even towns conserve land in their communities is through conservation restrictions or through what we call in fee. So the organization like Opacum Land Trust could own a property in fee, or we could own what is called the conservation restriction or hold what is the conservation restriction. And that's essentially, it's a legal binding document that is, the purpose is to protect the conservation values of the property, which can range from rare species that are found on that property, the wetlands, unique habitats, but it can also protect things such as cultural and historical aspects of the land. Some properties that have farming can put their land in a conservation restriction and continue to farm it. So you can have various different aspects of that property you want to protect, but essentially it's to not allow any sort of damage to those conservation values. So essentially no development to happen on the land unless and there's different flavors, you could say, of conservation restrictions. So for example, some people a private landowner may want to conserve their land, and they want to be able to have their kids build a house next to theirs in the future, so they can take out those 2 acres or whatever it is in Southbridge and exclude that from the conservation restriction, and then have the rest of their property, let's say it's like 50 acres, some road frontage, they have a house and 50 acres in the back and a little more frontage, but they want their kids to build a house, they can conserve the back 45 acres in a conservation restriction if they'd like to. So these types of conservation restriction runs with the land, which similar to a deed restriction, it's tied to the land and the property. So if the owner they can continue to own their land in fee, but they can also then hand it to a relative, and a relative could inherit it, or if they wanted to sell that property, they can still sell that property, but the CR goes with it. Let's see, so do you have any more thoughts on conservation restrictions in general? Not to put you on the spot.
Well,
but,
no.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the protection that the CR adds to the property, and I just want to emphasize that it's a permanent protection
Yes.
on the property. So Lainey gave an example of a private individual who may want to protect their property. Something that may have been in the family for years, and they want to keep that back 40 acres wild, or manage it for timber harvest for a little income or whatever, but they don't want to see it developed, and that's fine for that homeowner at that time. But when that person passes away, what happens to the property? And I think this is where a CR comes in, because the homeowner has made a deal with somebody like Opacum that they're saying this property is going to stay permanently protected in the condition that it is right now. Forests, vernal pools, whatever happens to be out there. This conservation restriction eliminates that possibility of the land being converted later on. And we can get into, the prohibited parts that go into a conservation restriction. Because basically a conservation restriction talks about the interests of that particular parcel, and each CR is crafted for that parcel. And then it talks about the prohibited uses, which sounds very onerous, but this is what we have to do. We have to lay it out. Cell towers, you're not going to turn it into a gravel bank. It's not going to be the next senior center. There are a lot of things that, very particular things that go into the conservation restriction. And I will say that it's not Opacum or the town that makes the restriction. We can draft it up, but it goes to the state for review. And they are very meticulous about how that wording, so that if it goes to court someday, it's a protectable conservation restriction. Those interests, the purpose of the CR is maintained.
Doesn't this
Ken.
go along with the deed? Does it get attached to the deed in the Worcester County?
It's registered.
It's
It's not
registered as
part.
a-
It's not part of the deed, but it's registered on the property. So it is a
So if you sell the property and all
Yeah.
Opacum's not involved,
yeah.
the new owner may not even know about the conservation restriction.
Oh, he certainly will.
He will be.
Yes.
How will he find out? Will the realtor?
The realtor should say
Should.
he buys the 40 acres. The realtor, if he's doing his job, should say, well, there's a conservation restriction
But how would he
here.
know?
It'll be in the chain of title, Ken.
Yes.
It will be on the title.
Yes.
It'll be in the chain of title.
So,
right?
so for instance, this is a parcel in Munson. It's over this margin here. It's recorded. When anybody looks up this parcel on Hovey Road in Munson, this is going to show up along with the deed,
Yeah,
any
so
surveys,
it's
or
attached to
anything
the
like
deed.
that.
Yeah.
Right, not, literally paper to paper, like deed isn't gonna show it, but it's in the chain of title.
Okay.
Yeah.
So anytime they do a title search, it's
Yeah.
gonna show up.
Yeah. It actually references the deed in here. within
I'm
the
just
CR.
wondering what if somebody wanted to get out of it? Is it like chapter 61, you have to
No,
sign up
no, it's
for
not.
it and
No,
stuff?
this is-
I just,
This is it.
It's permanent.
It's
Yep.
permanently
Okay.
protected. Long
Oh,
after
good.
we're gone,
Yep.
this will still be that
Yeah.
open space or a farm or whatever it is
Oh, good.
preserved for, protecting a watershed,
yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
Now, I mentioned the prohibited uses. I want to make sure that I mention the permitted uses of the property also. So with the property, there may be certain things that the owner wants to accomplish. Say the town owns the property, or Opacum holds the CR, the town may want hiking trails or something like that on there. So there'd be a provision in the permitted uses for that. The town may want to do a timber harvest at some point. So there would be a provision in there for a timber harvest. So the permitted stuff, first is the prohibited stuff, and then they tell you, but you can also do all this stuff. So I'm going to give you a couple of CRs that you could look at that are they're slightly different. Well, one is property owned by the town of Munson. Opacum holds the conservation restriction.
Yeah.
So there's talk of managing the forest. Some hiking trails in there, wildlife habitat was important. This other conservation restriction is on a privately owned parcel. And this actually two families side by side just wanted to keep the land the way it was. They didn't want to see it subdivided. They didn't want a cell tower on it or anything. They just wanted to keep it in woodland. But they didn't want to perform timber harvests on it. So they have the right within here to do their timber harvesting. So this is something when you get a CR or you assign a CR to somebody, you need to carefully go over what are you prohibiting, and then what are you going to allow the conservation holder or the property owner to allow? What are you going to allow them to do?
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought these examples because it's showing that certain entities can hold the conservation restriction. So Opacum Land Trust can hold a conservation restriction. Municipalities can hold conservation restrictions. DCR can hold a conservation restriction. So usually a conservation organization are the ones who hold the restrictions. And then the landowner, it can be a private landowner who owns the land, it could be municipal who owns the land, it could be Opacum who owns the land. We have a couple of our fee properties that have conservation restrictions held by DCR. One example is Dingley Dell in Brimfield, Opacum Woods in Sturbridge. DCR owns or holds the conservation restrictions on those properties, so they are just another layer of protection for, even though they're already conserved through Opacum, if something were to ever happen to our organization, those lands have another layer of protection with the conservation restriction. That also means, though, if we want to add trails or do work on our properties with conservation restrictions, we need to talk to the CR holder and make sure that it's good with them and fits within the conservation restriction. So there's a partnership that happens with having a conservation restriction on the land between the landowner and the CR holder. Another point with the CRs is that the landowner is the one who is responsible for, let's say there's an encroachment, a neighbor starts mowing their lawn a little further into their property. It would be up to the landowner to follow through and have a conversation with that neighbor, but of course the CR holder can help in ways. Opacum, we tend to try to help by providing resources or guidance if we have situations like that. So we don't want to just be an enforcer of a CR, though some organizations may prefer just to do that, but Opacum, we tend to like to have more of a conversation and a partnership to make sure we're all on the same page and we're on good relations with the landowner as well. Let's see.
Yeah, I think your point that it's a partnership.
Yeah.
We're both looking for the same thing, to preserve this as open space or in perpetuity. And so we work together to do this. We don't want to get to the point where, we're fighting you because you want to have a library on it or something. We have that goal together.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
That's where these get worked out. A lot of conversation goes on. What do you want to have happen there? What do we want to see protected?
Well, the program that I watched at MAC, they were saying, the person who presented, I can't remember his name, he was like, and a lot of times people, even though they've been a part of crafting this, they will forget things, and so he suggested walking the property a couple times a year, and one of the landowners was like, even though he had a CR, he was like, oh well, I want to build a shed, and he was like, I don't think you can.
Well, you can do stuff like that.
No, but on this particular one.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Generally, if there's any interest of building anything on the land, you want to think about that while you're crafting the CR. You want to have some forethought into that. So it's there, like the example I gave, where if it was a family who they know in 20 years they want their kids to build a house next to theirs, it's something to think about while writing the CR, so that you don't run into something where a family member wants to do something on the land, or a shed wants to be built, they want to build a shed and they just hadn't planned for it. So there's some forethought that needs to go into this document, and a lot of conversations between what the landowner's goals are in doing the conservation restriction as a tool for land conservation. Like you mentioned before, Chapter 61 is another option for landowners who want to keep their forests and want to manage them and have a tax break with that. One thing with the CRs is you can get a federal tax deduction, so there's a tax incentive for the landowner. They can have a federal tax deduction if they donate the conservation restriction. Conservation restrictions can also be sold as they are an aspect or a value of the land. But most of the time when we work with conservation restrictions, it's usually a donation of one, so they can have a tax break from that donation. And the state of Massachusetts, I brought some information, they have a separate conservation land tax credit that they do as well. It's specific only in Massachusetts, so you could get 2 breaks essentially, or 2 deductions based on that conservation restriction if you were to donate it. Or if you're working in a grant program, such as Forest Legacy Program, which we're doing, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about that if it's okay with you guys, but the Forest Legacy Program is actually paying the landowner up to 75% of the value of the CR to put it into this conservation, this form of conservation. So there are options, though oftentimes when you're working with nonprofits like Opacum, a donation is our bread and butter, to say the least. But we can find grants to pay for the conservation restriction. As we understand, landowners have financial needs as well. And if there's a way we can write them into a grant, that would be great. But grants do take years, so it's a game of patience, but it's worth it, because then it works out well for the landowner's goals in conserving their land, but also if they are in this grant, they can have some compensation for the conservation restriction.
So I think these brochures would be great to leave upstairs, because if people are watching this and they want more information on it, they can come to the town hall.
Yep. Yeah, we'll leave some Opacum general
Okay.
information brochures on that.
And please, if anybody has any inquiries, we have a website. And they can certainly, check on the website. That'll point them in direction for information. Contact us, and we'd be happy to talk to people. If somebody's interested in preserving that 40 acres that's been in the family for a long time, they should know what their options are and plan ahead. Because as I said, when the parents die and you have 6 children that now have inherited the 40 acres, they don't live around here, it's going to get subdivided. If you truly, if an individual truly wants to protect that land, they need to think for the future and act on it. Conservation restriction's a great idea.
Do many towns that you know of have a reduction in property tax because you put your property into this conservation restriction?
I think it's like chapter land. So I think the value is lowered, so the value of the land is lowered, so the taxes are lower.
So they reassess your property based on...
Yes, because you can't develop it. So those 6 frontage lots you had on the road are no longer worth $60,000, $80,000 each.
So if you have, let's just say for instance, you have cranberries, which is $60 an acre valuation, something like that. And he also now automatically donates it to you as a conservation restriction, no more cranberries. So the value is going to go way, way down. Will that show up on your taxes? I mean, you're devaluing the property because you can't develop it. You can't build anything on it.
Right.
It's only used for educational and recreational purposes. So that demeans the property value. How does that work in terms of the town assessment?
Well, I think as I said, it's not developable anymore. So I'm not sure exactly how they would work that out, but I would think it would almost be taxed as like backland, like Chapter 61.
Yeah, but Woodlands is only $4 an acre per year. I mean, something like that, right?
tax wise, or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Woods and swamps is even I think it's 250 for swamp land.
Yeah. I'm not
I mean,
quite
it's even
sure
less
how
valuable.
that works.
Contractors
I would have
consider
to-
wetlands garbage. You know,
Yeah.
they have no use for them at all. They're
Yeah.
happy to get rid of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I,
Somebody might see that as more valuable in themselves. You know, developers may see wetlands as garbage, but there's a lot of value to them.
Yeah.
They're
Well,
beautiful.
we know that.
yeah,
That's right.
and they,
We're
yep,
preaching to the choir on that one. So.
provide lots of services
So I
for
think
sure.
the thinking needs to be changed.
Definitely.
So these values you can get, or the reductions in your taxes, property is for property tax from the federal government, you say?
So I think that would be the
Income
town,
tax?
town real estate
It's the
tax.
town.
Real estate tax.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The assessor.
yeah.
But I don't pay federal real estate tax that I'm aware of. Federal?
No,
No, I'm
There is no
sorry.
federal real estate tax.
No,
Yeah.
right. So I'm
So
curious.
I'm saying,
It's local tax.
if
How's
someone
it-
were to donate their conservation restriction, they could get a donation deduction on their federal taxes. They could,
like a gift to a charitable
Yes.
organization.
yes, exactly. And then there's also a Massachusetts one as well, so you could do one at
So
federal
that
and
was
state
like
level.
1% on
It would reduce
anything over
your.
10,000.
Well, it's like the electric car tax, where if the tax deduction on an electric car, if you buy an electric car, and the manufacturer is sold under, I cannot remember the exact number of units, but if they're under that number of units, you can qualify for an $850 or $8,500 tax break, which basically says that your total income, if it's 100,000, let's say, is now subtract, so it's 9150 instead of 100,000. Is your actual, that's your actual.
That's significant.
So potentially your income, if you're donating a large piece of property that may have a value of $100,000, $200,000, and you're donating that as conservation land, you get that big of a break off of your income on your taxes. So it's you don't actually end up seeing any money other than that you're not paying into the government any money.
Is that just for 1 year or for
It's 1 year.
multiple years?
It's
I think it's 5 years. I think
Oh, okay.
I think for a donation or a gift, I think you can spread your
Okay,
taxes
you
out
can spread it
over
out.
5 years.
Okay.
Well, that'd be because
there's
the
an
value is so large.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you draft this?
That's great.
This conservation restrictions is pretty much like a contract.
Yes.
Yeah.
Draft that?
So there's actually a template from the state because it needs to be reviewed with EEA, and the acronym is
Energy and environmental.
agency, I think. But there's a state agency who has a template that we utilize and draft the conservation restriction for. Opacum can draft them, but there's also other private consultants who do environmental consulting who draft conservation restrictions. Lawyers can also take that template and help to draft that conservation restriction, but it's really helpful to have somebody who is familiar with the conservation values or working with the landowner on the conservation values to then fill in what are the most important aspects of this property to be protecting, because it's important to spell that out so that everybody understands what the different parts, if it's the wetlands or if it's the old farmhouse stone artifacts that are there, or if there's rare species there, that's outlined in the conservation restrictions. So so there is a template, and like Glenn was mentioning earlier, there's a whole process to writing a conservation restriction, and I'm actually working through those right now with the Forest Legacy program. I'm first, so I'm drafting the conservation restrictions as Opacum from that template, working with the landowners, meeting with them, reviewing it. It can be a daunting document for somebody not familiar with it, so I'm happy to hold hands and say, here, let's go step by step. What do each of these things mean? Because the first section is what you can't do, and then the next section gives you back some things like you can't I'm trying to think of a good example here. It's saying you can't remove any vegetation. In like the first part of the CR, it'll say you can't do anything. But then the second part, it'll say under a forest management plan, you can do timber harvest, you can control invasive species. So they first will take away some of those rights, but then give them back to whatever is benefiting the conservation of that property. So it can be a daunting document at first when you're first going through it. But I work with the landowner, and then we will give it to the state to review, and the state will review it, have lots of edits or thoughts, and send it back to us to do some more edits. And it's a back and forth with the state as well before it finally gets to a point where everybody agrees on it, to then be recorded and approved, because the state will be signing off of it, and depending on if the town is taking on the CR, the select board may need to review it, the Conservation Commission will review it and sign off. So there's a lot of signatures to collect for this restriction before it is finally recorded. So yeah, it's a process, but it's something that Opacum is always happy to help with. And if it's something that we can't do, we have suggestions of private consultants. Mass Land, which is a statewide organization supporting land trusts, has a lot of great resources. Land Trust Alliance, and like you said, the Massachusetts Association of Conservation Commissions has lots of great resources to help people wrap their heads around CRs, draft the CRs, and go through that whole process. So we're happy to assist as we can in that process, for sure.
So the landowner himself had a lot of input in the very beginning, right? You went over and discussed this with him, his options, what he wants to restrict this. Do you have it surveyed, the property?
It depends. If the boundaries are not well defined in the deeds, then yes.
Well, if he wants to chop off a section, like you said, for maybe 12 acres
yes,
for his
then you would
family,
survey that. Mm-hmm.
So you got to hack that out. That's got to be legally documented.
Yes.
So who pays
Correct.
that?
Absolutely.
Who pays for the surveyor?
It depends, I think.
I would think that it would be the landowner. He wants to preserve that envelope to give to his kids later on. So if he wants the 10 acres, then he would be footing that bill to get the surveyor out there.
Yeah.
Now it also goes through a review by an attorney. Are you either attorneys?
No, but
So-
Opacum has an attorney, and we usually suggest the landowner consult their attorney as well in going through this process, and have their attorney review the CR as well to make sure that their rights and interests are
So
protected.
it's reviewed before it goes to the state EOC, and then it's reviewed on coming back from them by the attorney?
I think their attorney would want to get involved with it very early and just see
For
how
sure.
it progresses.
Right.
Because the state does have a lot of input in it.
Right, and he'll
So-
check it on the way home
Yes.
after it's all done, before it's actually signed.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's 2 attorney fees. Who pays that?
That would be the landowner would be responsible for their own attorney to review it. And we always advise that the landowners have an attorney to review it, but some landowners don't always do that. But it is an advisable action, and some people maybe the cost of an attorney fee could be a barrier. But yeah, so there are costs in doing in conserving your land, and most of the time, depending on what it is, Opacum tries to work with landowners on that. There are some things that the landowner needs to cover. There are other things Opacum would either look for grants or fundraise for to help cover in a land transaction, especially if it's a donation. We try to work with a landowner to help them through that process. So especially if they're very strongly interested in protecting that land, we will try to work with them as best as we can to make that happen. So these are all good questions, getting into the nitty-gritties of CRs. Absolutely, that's why I brought Glenn with me. He's got a lot of experience, as you can see, in doing this type of work. So another thing I thought I would talk about quick for CRs is stewardship and monitoring. So when Opacum or a town or another group is doing a CR, you usually want to have what's called a baseline documentation report completed, which is basically looking at the property at that point in time. When you're accepting the CR, you want to know what are the conditions of that property. So let's just say there was an old garbage dump there and there's some tires. You would note that in the baseline documentation report, hopefully have a plan to clean that up as best as you can, but it would be very different. You would note that as that was the condition that the land came in, there was a small dump here, so that later down the line it's not a surprise to anybody, or if there's dumping reoccurring again, then that's something that the landowner and the conservation restriction holder would need to address and say, okay, we knew about this, but now there's a new site where tires are showing up. This is a problem. We need to address this. So we want to know what's the condition of the property when it goes into a conservation restriction, and that's so very important, because you don't want to have something down the line show up and not have that baseline documentation report to refer back to and say, no, this truly wasn't here, or no, this neighbor has been encroaching and trimming back the trees to make their lawn bigger, or whatever would happen between abutters or trespassing or things like that on the property. And then monitoring is really important too. They recommend annual monitoring, or at least something regular and consistent in monitoring. So just to check in, and that would be the conservation restriction holder would do the monitoring, and just check on the property and walk the boundaries, make sure there's no encroachments, check on the trails, maybe check some of the important resources there, and make sure that there isn't anything impacting those conservation values of the property. Let's see, so, and then they happen occasionally. There are occasionally violations and in ways that need to be addressed for that. We try to really work with the landowner and try to talk to whoever may be violating, trespassing, dumping, encroaching on the land to correct that. But the conservation restriction holder has a responsibility to protect that land and enforce that CR. And if it had to come down to it, going through the legal processes, the CR holder has a responsibility to follow through on that and make sure that that land is being protected. So I don't think we have any major issues on our CRs that we've had to actually pursue that, but we've had to have some conversations with landowners or work with the landowners to then talk to neighbors who, are impacting the land in different ways. So we try to go as peaceable of a route as we can at first, but ultimately when Opacum holds a CR, we are in charge of protecting those conservation values.
I do stewardship inspections, and most of the stuff that we see is, the neighbors piling brush in the conservation land, or, something to that effect. Is, he's now storing, a trailer just over the property line, and in most instances, all you have to do is talk to the person and say, gee, you notice that you're, dumping your grass clippings on the conservation land. Could you, kindly refrain from that? And, most people are happy to be next to conservation land, and they'll quickly agree to, stop that.
Yeah.
It's only really when, there's a major encroachment that we have to kind of put our foot down and say, look, the landowner, we own the CR, but we're informing the landowner, you have a problem, and you need to figure out the problem with this abutter that is not working with us. So 99% of the time, it's just a matter of, hey, that's our property, please don't do that anymore.
Speaking of encroachment, this has come up in Southbridge in other situations, but what would you do if it was encroached by a drone?
Ooh. Ooh. Ooh.
Giving you a challenge here.
Yeah.
It's
Oh.
transient.
What?
It's just transient. How they gonna?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't
I
think
mean,
that,
what if the
No,
owners
these are-
didn't like that though?
well, I don't think that would have any impact to the conservation values of the
Yeah.
property.
Yeah.
So
So
it's probably nothing that
it's
we would pursue. I think that's more of a privacy issue
Yeah.
with the landowner than anything that would be covered within
Yeah.
the conservation restriction. We don't have
Okay.
anything in here that says no drones.
Yeah.
No, that's
I'm
a
just
good,
curious
good
because we've been
question,
talking about
yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Right, interesting question, especially, as technology develops
Right.
and people are flying more drones around,
Yeah.
how do you, that's, as Glenn said, as long as it's not impacting the conservation
Right.
values. Now, if the drone starts to drop trash in there, then we may need to talk to
Yeah.
the drone driver and say,
Yeah.
Don't give them
Hey,
any
look,
idea.
drone.
yeah,
Or if it's harassing that bald eagle or
right,
something.
yeah, right,
You know,
yeah.
we're gonna get after them for
Right.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Oh, Gus is.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Couple, actually. One is, I know that in most cases, the landowner approaches you. Are there circumstances where you will approach landowners because you have specific properties in mind that you want to pursue? And how does that work out?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, yeah,
I can tell you from, not my work with Opacum, but as the Conservation Commissioner in Munson, that we do that. If we see a property, especially adjoining properties adjacent to already preserved open space, if I see that go on the market, I want to be talking with that landowner right away and find out, are you interested in conservation? Because a lot of the purchases that we do are fair market value. We'll get a certified appraisal and we can offer up to that amount. Hopefully they'll knock the price down a little bit and give us a bargain sale for a tax break, but we can give them up to that certified appraised price on that parcel.
And I was curious because I know that there's a parcel down the hill from us that I know that you've started doing trails on, and I'm not clear on whether you actually own them or it's a CR and the current owners of them. I'm thinking of the parcel. It's
Is it B?
the Morse
Yeah.
part. It's either
Oh.
Morse.
Oh, okay, yeah, so I brought this map for that purpose. So this is a map we've created specifically for Opacum properties. And we have, in conservation restriction are the ones in yellow, and then owned by Opacum is purple. So you can see we do have some properties we own in Southbridge. So we have Morneau Farm that Opacum owns. It was a land, the owner passed away and we were in his will to take the land. So that's how we acquired Morneau Farm. And then we have Claire Burt's, which is 19. And then last year we had this parcel from the Morse family donated to Opacum Land Trust. And we did put trails on it this spring. We just haven't caught up to making a trail map yet to show how it connects to Claire Burt's. But there is a big loop trail, so if you want a good hike in the woods, it's a really nice hike there. And then we also own the property, the Thompson Family Preserve. Here also has trails. I forget the road it's off of. I brought trail maps.
Eastford.
Thank you. Thank you. So those have properties, at least Claire Burt's and Thompson have trails. Morneau, we actually don't have trails on just because we have an active farm there and we want to respect the privacy of the tenant farmers. But otherwise we have those two properties and hopefully some more. You can see we have some more projects going on in the southern part of Southbridge if you have some more questions, I'd be happy to answer.
I know some of them.
Yeah.
I think if I remember correctly, we worked from the council's point of view. I think we worked with you guys to do a conservation easement on a property over in Alpine.
Okay. Yes.
I can't remember which one it is off the top of my head, but
Yep.
So, is there any for some of those parcels? Will those ever turn into actual? Because I know in that case, I think it's still the owner still owns it, and it's
Yes.
more or less restricted access to it.
Yep. I'm so glad you asked that question
And
because
how do you define how that works out, and does that ever transition into like public access?
yes, so specifically for the parcel on Alpine Drive, it's in a grant that Ed Hood, my predecessor, had written in 2019, and he talked to the town about these conservation restrictions. So it's the Forest Legacy Program, and we were awarded that grant last year. So the way, for at least the parcel on Alpine Road, the way it's going to work is first the private landowners, they're going to go through the Forest Legacy grant, and we're assisting them. We're a facilitator for the grant, and they will have a conservation restriction placed on their property. The grant will help to pay for some of the value of that conservation restriction to that private landowner. And so first step is the conservation restriction, which it's actually a conservation restriction that Ed Hood had worked with the town for the town to hold on this parcel on Alpine Drive. And then step 2 of that property that we're hoping to continue working with that private landowner to then do a bargain sale to Opacum and open up trails on that property. I'm really excited about this property. Actually, it has so many great values to it. It abuts a lot of the water supply land here, so it has water on it, so it's just a great resource in protecting drinking water in Southbridge. It also has a lot of beautiful wetlands and forested uplands. There's some forestry that was done in the past there, and therefore there's some great trails there. And the family is very, very interested in seeing this land conserved. So it's so great to work with an enthusiastic family for such a large parcel of land with such great value to it. So that was one of the parcels I'm excited to talk to you guys about tonight, because in 2023, as we're working through the Forest Legacy Grant, the different due diligence parts, so title searches, writing the CR and working with lawyers to review the CR, getting a survey, getting an appraisal. So we have some steps to do before that, but hopefully by the end of 2023, we'll be working with the town to finish and close on the CR there. So, and that was one of the parcels in Southbridge with the Forest Legacy project. The other one is Morneau Farm, so owned by Opacum, and eventually we're working on the process right now of the Forest Legacy CR so that the town would hold the conservation restriction on that property and Opacum would own the land. So that was a great leeway to what I wanted to talk about with Forest Legacy, so I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Also, I was curious, I know you guys were talking earlier about how the CRs are permanent. Are there any legal ways that somebody down the road can break a CR? I don't want to see it happen.
Yeah. But. No, that's a great question.
What if the state comes in and says, we got to put a road across your property?
Eminent domain.
Yeah. So if there's a situation of eminent domain, I don't think the conservation restriction would hold that up. Let's hope it doesn't happen, but or at least doesn't impact the important conservation values of that property. But that example for eminent domain, I think that would take precedence. So there's never been an example of a CR being removed off of the land in Massachusetts or in the U.S. In other states, this type of restriction, it's actually called a conservation easement. We're different in Massachusetts, and we call it a conservation restriction.
Same thing?
Yes, same exact thing, just different names. I don't know why it worked out that way, but it's just the way it worked out. So it would be, there would be a lot of, I don't think it's possible. I think the state, there'd have to be a very, very good reason to remove the CR, and oftentimes and this rarely happens too, CRs have been amended, but they're only amended to help with that in a way that doesn't harm the conservation values or enhances the conservation values that you would want to amend it. But it's once the CR is completed, it's permanent. And honestly, I think it would set a very dangerous precedent to have a CR ever removed off of a land, because then it kind of opens up this,
I've seen it happen on conservation easements in Connecticut.
Okay.
The town I used to work for, but it took
Interesting,
the
yeah.
red tape was insane. To
Yeah, I
actually
think
get
it's
it all.
actually an act of the legislature that needs a
Maybe in
vote.
Massachusetts, yeah.
Yeah.
In Connecticut, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Okay.
The towns have control
Interesting.
of things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Good to know because I only have experience in Massachusetts, so I wasn't sure if that has ever happened in other states. But yeah, I don't believe it's ever happened in Massachusetts, and I think it'd be difficult to remove that.
So if you want to have a good time, while you're driving, ask Siri the difference between a conservation restriction and an easement, and she will fill you with full of rhetoric. So the next question is, what's the address on Alpine Drive?
It doesn't
It-
have one
Yeah, I don't think it has one.
because it's vacant land.
Do you know where it is?
I do.
All right, you don't mind if he tells me?
Bob Parr's land.
It's,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, it
it's
is
behind,
Bob- yeah,
yeah,
Bob
we've
Parr's.
done a sidewalk
Okay,
there.
Bob Parrott, sure, I know Bob.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a pond back
Is he still
there.
in town?
There's many ponds.
No. He passed away, and now the
No,
land
this
is
is not the father. The father.
the father. Mhm.
Rob's fine.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. There's
Yeah.
also Rob, his son. Yes,
Yeah.
is fine. Yes, yes.
He's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
So he's still living there.
I believe.
No, actually,
No.
Rob passed away too.
Rob Parrott?
That's what I
Yeah,
thought,
Billy
yeah.
Parrott passed away.
Yeah.
Oh my
The only one left
He
is,
was younger than us, than you.
yeah.
There's so the two the family members I met. I did meet Bill once, and he passed away in the spring. I met Rick, Nancy, and Rob.
And he's got a sister.
Yes, Nancy.
Nancy,
Is she fine?
Yes.
she lives there.
Yes. She,
Okay, so
yeah.
so they're not getting rid of the property.
No, they are.
They're working with us to do the conservation restriction through the Forest Legacy grant.
But Rick died?
No, not Rick, Rob.
Okay. I'll get it straight.
And Don-
Just bear with me.
Donald, I don't know.
I didn't know.
You look like you have a question. Yes.
Yes, a related question. Is the CR ever adjustable? In other words, if originally you say your CR is going to be for just woodland preservation, and then further down the road, you decide you want to add forestry management, or any other changes, is it adjustable in the future, or should you basically put all that you can in the original CR, because if further down the road it's too difficult to change?
Let's see. Usually with a conservation restriction, they will refer to something called a forest management plan, which again is something the private landowner would work to have or work with a forester
Right.
to do that on their
Can't
land.
clear cut it.
That would be determined in
Call
the forest management plan. So those need to be renewed every 10 years.
Okay.
And so if they wanted to change their forestry practices, they could in that forest management plan. The CR would just be referencing that. So if they couldn't clear cut it, but if they wanted to do some logging, a timber harvest, make a little money off the property, as long as they're working with a forester and it works with their forest management plan, there's a
Let me try to
possibility.
explain
Yeah,
this.
sure.
Let's say there's a CR
Mhm.
on a piece of property, and a project comes along that wants to put a walking trail on it. If the walking trail is not allowed in the CR, can the CR ever be changed to allow?
I think as long as it doesn't impact the conservation values of the property, there may be a possibility to amend a CR. It's not common, but there may be a possibility to amend it, and especially if it is benefiting the
Conservation.
yeah, so let's say, for example, a big hurricane comes through, let's hope not ever, but a big hurricane comes through and knocks down a lot of trees in that woods and they want to do a salvage harvest. But for some reason the CR says no timber harvest whatsoever. Maybe there could be an amendment to, because of this act
Active.
Right.
act of nature. But so there are
Good example.
there may be some instances where you could amend a CR. And I don't know if you've had, you may
No,
have more experience.
No, I haven't seen anything come up like that.
Yeah.
Because I think, like you mentioned, you want to catch that first.
Yeah.
And get it in there, and maybe word it vaguely enough so that you would cover, timber harvest, the health of the forest, and anything else. Even, you may be able to do something like change the nature of the forest for a certain type of bird that might nest out there. Something like that that's beneficial to wildlife, would probably be allowed within a cutting plan or a management plan, I'd say, not a cutting plan.
The landowner will always have say over anything, even if it's allowed within the CR. So let's say it's allowed within the CR to put a walking trail.
So he would have,
Does he still have the ability to say, well, I don't really like that walking trail idea, I don't want it?
he could absolutely have that reserved. That I could build trails, it's a reserved right, but if he doesn't want to do it, he doesn't have to do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He still oversees.
Yeah, because he owns the land, so
Right,
he
yeah.
controls it. We're just saying, no cell towers and wind generators and so
He
forth.
controls.
But
the
he can control that. So that's a situation where you might want to put that in just in case you want to do it somewhere down the line.
Right.
But it's not. You don't have to
Yeah.
do it. And even if it's in here to build trails, you still want to make sure that those trails, when they're built, don't interfere with the purpose, the things that you're protecting with the conservation restriction. So you don't want to build a ton of trails that is going to scare every deer, every turkey and grouse and everything,
Yeah.
out of that 40 acres. You want to keep it the way it looks in the baseline document report.
Yeah.
You don't want to change it that much. So in 20 years, you can go back with that baseline document report and say, this is what we started with. Do we still have that? Yeah.
I think 15 years ago, Sturbridge and DCR bought 800 acres from Old Sturbridge Village.
They did. Lead Mine Mountain.
Exactly. Now, was there conservation restrictions on that property?
Fish and Game has that conservation restriction. Yes,
Okay.
there is.
But there are there, because I know they can't put bridges and they can't put parking lots, they're very restricted in what they do. So that's so there are restrictions on, there are conservation restrictions that were implemented from the very beginning.
Right.
Okay.
Yes. So I know Sturbridge did have an issue at one time with Fish and Game because they wanted too many trails. And
Right.
Fish and Game
They were-
said the
they've
density
cut-
of your
they've
trail
shut-
system is too
They've knocked
much.
it down to probably 20% of the trails that were in there before.
Yeah, if you might have seen their master plan for trails, it was one man from Fish and Game called it a labyrinth of trails, and it truly was. And Fish and Game just says we can't have this. This is a wildlife management area. Basically, it's preserved for wildlife, so they had to tone it down, and eventually came to an agreement where south of the pipeline is sanctuary, north of the pipeline is more developed with trails.
Thank you.
I have another question, but I don't know if you guys want to
Sure.
have more information.
We'll do our best to answer. Yeah.
Is there any gift that a conservation commission would not want to accept as a CR? Either in size or
Well-
in property
Yes.
degradation or whatever?
I would say yes.
Yeah.
Our focus is to try and get properties with significant value to them, wildlife habitat, maybe an endangered species or something like that. Maybe it abuts another open space parcel, wildlife management area, whatever it happens to be. Those are the valuable ones. But you don't want to take responsibility for that last lot in the subdivision that's all swamp. And he just wants to get it off the tax rolls.
Yeah.
So he wants you to take it And you don't want that piece.
Yeah.
So that's just too much to monitor and make sure nothing happens to it.
To
There-
a lot of
yeah.
neighbors.
So you do
Yeah.
have to look at them and make that hard decision. Is this valuable for conservation, or is it just never gonna get built on anyway and maybe it just stays the way it
Yeah.
is? So definitely look at the parcels that you're
Okay.
interested
Yeah.
in and see how valuable they are.
Yeah. It's always good to have that internal assessment too of, is this something we want to take on? What would be the challenges? Opacum has our own policy for land that we're willing to take in fee or a conservation restriction on. You know, so we have, when landowners approach us and say they'd like to conserve their land, we look through that list and think about, does it fit all of our criteria of important land to protect in the region? Because we can't, you know, the reality is you can't protect everything, and sometimes it makes more sense to develop certain places and leave other places in their natural state. So I think it is important to have some sort of criteria to look at anytime people approach with an interest to conserve their land, because it just may not fit in the end, or may not be the work of keeping that land protected, may be more than what it's really valued on a conservation level. So yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely.
That makes me think of the parcel that's sitting where it's at the landfill, frankly. The one that we ended up putting into chapter 90, whatever chapter.
I thought it was 97.
Chapter 97 land, yeah. But really,
But that's the
it's-
state.
Yeah, but that's all wetland is basically inaccessible to anything. Except a landfill falling into it.
Oh geez.
It was something that, this was at least 10 years ago.
Yeah, the Conservation Commission owns quite a bit of property. It's all wetlands, it's all swampland.
That's the good stuff. That's
See,
where
I
the
think-
wildlife
I think
is.
that's So good,
Yeah.
right.
Oh, that was
It's good for
the question.
stormwater, you know, if you get big flood events, wetlands can soak that
Well,
up.
it's in a very unique place. It does a fantastic job of filtering what came up our landfill before it goes into the brook. But you can't put a trail in there. You can't use it for anything. You couldn't put a playground on it, let alone use it for anything. But that's fine.
It's good for the wildlife,
Yeah.
so.
That raises another
It's
question.
better now with a couple other tires out of it.
How do you balance, for example, if the Conservation Commission were to be the one holding the CR, how would you think the Conservation Commission would balance the overall, the legal function of the Concom protecting the wetlands of town versus the more generic Concom function of protecting land in general, which is the older version of the law. But it's unfortunately legally weaker.
I think it works hand in hand. You know, the conservation restriction certainly looks at the values of the property, you know, for wildlife or and whatever. Whereas the Wetlands Protection Act will handle more of your wetlands issues, the wetlands crossings, endangered species in wetlands and so forth. So they work hand in hand. One doesn't overrule the other. Even if you have the conservation restriction that says trails, you still need to get that permit from the Conservation Commission if you're crossing a brook with that trail.
Yep.
One thing I wanted to just throw out there, conservation restrictions are a great tool to get money. I don't know if you have passed Community Preservation Act
No.
in Southbridge.
We're gonna try again.
So I'll give you an example of why you should.
Listen,
Munson passed it at 3%, right way at the very beginning. I recently, I'm in the process of buying 63 acres of land for about $400,000. I'm getting a reimbursement grant from the state, a land grant, and it's a 68% reimbursement. So out of that $4,000 for the land, the town is only spending about $1,000 on it. So conservation restrictions, you know, can you would have to assign a conservation restriction to that land, but it would allow you to get things like the land grant from the state. You can get CPA when you pass it.
Yeah.
You know, CPA money is available to you, and Forest Service grants also are a great way to expand your money. You know, it's
So
a
you're
great
saying
deal.
once you have CPA,
Yeah.
you're more likely to get a grant to buy property?
Well, I don't know if you're more likely to get a grant, but it would reduce your the purchase.
Okay, so let's change it around here. Let's say if you have conservation restriction on the property, then are you more likely to be able to spend the CPA money on that property?
No, because if you've got a conservation restriction on it, CPA probably would say that property's already protected. So
Okay.
you wouldn't want to spend your money on that because you're already protecting it with a conservation restriction.
Okay.
Yeah. And like Glenn was saying, Forest Legacy is a federal, from the U.S. Forest Service, it's a federal grant that, again, Opacum's helping to facilitate, but there's also the land grant, something that towns can apply for, also the community forest grants from the Forest Service that towns can apply for. We just completed a project in Holland where we assisted the town to acquire a parcel of land, but these grants also required a CR to be placed on that land, and so Opacum partnered with the town and helped with those grants to make sure that the town was able to acquire that land with the grant funding, and then Opacum holds the CR now on the property. This closed we just acquired this a couple months ago, so it's a really wonderful example of a great partnership between a town and a conservation organization, and we're always happy to help where we can in Southbridge for sure. So
Is that the sickle property in Holland?
yes, correct.
And I have a piece of property in mind, so I will call
Okay.
you guys and pick your brains. I don't want to
Yeah.
mention it.
Yeah, for sure.
Are you thinking the same? Okay.
I'm actually thinking that one too.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, yeah. Thank you again for having us.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah,
We
thank
greatly
you. This is
appreciate
great.
it. And
Yeah.
yeah, so we can get a hold of you on your website, which is
Yep, www.opacumlt.org, and we'll leave some info brochures with you guys and put some up front there. I think we already have some information with the tree planting program, but we'll go and double check. But I'll leave some brochures. I'll leave a couple copies of these maps for you guys if you want to learn a little bit more about where we work and what we own and what properties are open to the public with trails and things like that. For you guys, and then finally for the Conservation Commission, I left some example monitoring forms from Opacum of what it looks like, what kind of a form we do when we monitor a property, and I also left some information about the Forest Legacy program, as we'll be coming back here next year and talking with you guys some more about that project and that grant and the inner workings of that.